What if I told you you don't need acres of land to grow a food forest? In fact, I've designed thriving food forests as small as a couple of meters squared. I'll show you exactly how small a food forest can be and how to design your own, even if you've only got room for one tree. I'm Pippa Chapman and I help people grow food forests, whether you've got a huge back garden or a tiny corner of a yard. I want to show people that you can grow a food forest no matter what space you've got available. And I'm going to show you some real life examples of small scale food forests to show you just what you can fit into a tiny space. I'm going to talk you through a design that I did for the Harrogate Flower Show that won Best in Show, which was just simply the size of one small flower border. And also a 3 metre by 3 metre design I designed for a community garden where all the fruit trees are trained against the walls, so you don't even have to be able to fit a tree into your garden to be able to grow a food forest like this. So first of all, I thought it'd be useful to sort of define what a forest garden or a food forest is, because you might be thinking, how on earth can I fit a forest into a tiny garden? Obviously, you're not going to be able to fit lots of giant trees in your garden, but really food forests, it's just a concept. It's about taking inspiration from nature. It's about looking at how the ecosystem of a forest functions and looking at the patterns of how a forest grows. So looking at all the different layers. So usually in forest gardening we say there's 7 layers. There's a large canopy tree, a smaller tree layer, underneath that the shrubs, then the herbaceous perennials, then even below those the ground cover plants that are covering the soil, and then growing crops that grow below the ground, so in the root zone or the rhizosphere, and then growing up through all of those layers we've got the climbers. So we look at all those different layers, and that is really the concept. That's the pattern that we're wanting to follow. That's the ecosystem that we are learning from. But it doesn't mean that we have to squeeze a forest into our gardens in order to call it a food forest. Really, so long as we're following those concepts and we're growing in a way that is working with nature, so we're inviting in, we're creating habitat for nature and wildlife to share these spaces with us. And so long as we're using materials that are sustainable, ideally from within our own garden, then we are growing a food forest. By mimicking the way that a forest grows, even if we've just got one tree, what we're really looking at is creating a kind of self-sustaining system, so one that doesn't require many inputs, making it really low maintenance, which is great for those of us who have really busy lifestyles. I mean, yes, I love gardening, but most of my time is spent looking after other people's gardens, so my garden tends to get a bit neglected, and so forest gardening is a really brilliant way of being able to grow my own food, but with very little inputs, but also in a way that makes it just a real haven for wildlife. So we're trying really hard not to worry about size. We're just looking at stacking and adding in those layers. You know, forest gardening is all about trying to maximise the use of the vertical space rather than spreading our food crops out over a huge area. So we're really trying to pack in as many plants as we can into one small area. So even if you only have a couple of square metres, you can still fit in some fruit, some perennial vegetables, some herbs, some plants for pollinators, habitat for wildlife, and create it to be a really beautiful garden. I'm really on a mission to show people that you can grow a food forest anywhere. You don't need a big garden, you don't need a space. Even if you've just got a balcony or room for just one planter, you can still achieve a food forest. Don't wait for the perfect plot. You know, many of us have plans to one day buy an acre of land and grow a food forest. But why wait? Why not just start now, even if you just have a really small space? You're going to learn so much about how plants interact with each other, about what kind of gardening that you enjoy, trying out some of the crops to see what you like to eat, so that if one day you're lucky enough to get a big garden or an acre of land or 10 acres of land or 100 acres of land, you've already started on your learning journey. So I did suggest that I would talk about exactly how small a food forest can be. So I want to talk you through a couple of designs that I have done in the past. One was a food forest border for the Harrogate Flower Show, which is a flower show near me, and I created this border so that it was a talking point, an example, a living example to talk to gardeners who come to the show. You know, there's sort of 60,000 visitors, I think, over the weekend. So to be able to have a real living example of what a food forest is and how it can be just as beautiful as a normal garden. And it was really popular. It was great to chat with people about it and show just how much you can pack into a small space by using the layering. And one of the nicest things that happened actually at the show was that totally unexpectedly, because I wasn't trying to win a prize, I was just trying to demonstrate forest gardening. This border won the best in show, which was fantastic. And one of the things that the judges said was they really loved how the garden was beautiful and edible and great for wildlife, but also it was the first time that they'd had to fact check a garden, because in the garden I put labels on everything and some wooden labels to show what part of each plant was useful or edible. And they had not believed me that hostas were edible, so they'd had to fact check to learn themselves that hostas were in fact edible. So it was really great. They'd said it was fantastic that this show garden had also been a learning experience for them as well. So that felt really really fun. That the judges had loved it, but also that they'd learnt something as well on the day. I think what people really loved about it was that it was such a small space. You know, they could fit this food forest into just one section of a border within their garden, or one raised bed, or even a large planter. It was the scale of it that made it really relatable for people, rather than showing them an example of an acre of forest gardening and then them just thinking, well, how on earth does that relate to my own garden? You know, this showed that you can fit a food forest into even a tiny space. Another example is a 3 metre by 3 metre forest garden that I designed for Horton Community Farm in Bradford. And the plan for this garden was actually to make it really small scale. So yes, I could plant one tree in a 3 metre by 3 metre garden, but if I did that, it would shade a large part of the garden, so then everything else that had to go in that space would need to be shade tolerant. So what I actually did was I took the trees and the shrubs and I designed them to be trained around the edges. So yes, there was a fruit tree, but it was espaliered against a wall. There were some raspberries, but they were also trained against the wall. There was a trained currant, red currant, and also a japonica, a Japanese quince. But all of those were trained against the outside of the garden, so that within the main body of the garden there was plenty of space for sunlight, for sun-loving crops as well. So it didn't limit so much what I would grow. And we still have all the layers in there, the trees and the shrubs and the climbers, ground covers, herbaceous plants, root crops. All of those layers are still within the garden. And the updated version that I did 10 years later, after I'd kind of revisited this 3 metre by 3 metre idea, 10 years later, having done a lot more forest gardening, I added in, you know, a lot more habitat, a small pond, a stone pile, a log pile, all of these things that were missing from the original design. But now I've, you know, through my forest gardening career, have learned how much this habitat is important. Not just in terms of increasing biodiversity, but to help with natural pest management and to help combat the biodiversity crisis that we're going through at the moment. When you're trying to decide what plants to grow in a small space, because you're so limited by the space that you've got, you really want each plant to tick as many boxes as you can. So obviously you've got the 7 layers, but within a food forest, we want to also our plants to meet certain functions as well. So yes, some might be edible, but we also have other ecosystem functions. So one is plants for pollinators, so plants to feed insects and also to bring in those beneficial insects which will help to fight pests. And we also want to add in fertility plants, so they might be nitrogen fixing plants to help to build fertility in our garden, so that we're not having to bring in external fertilizers or mulches. We can sort of create that fertility within the garden. And also we want things like the ground cover plants to fulfill that function of keeping the soil covered, which in nature soil is covered unless there's been some kind of like landslide or forest fire or an animal's come and dug a hole. You know, nature is always wanting the soil to be covered, so we want to add in ground cover plants as well. But if we're careful and we choose carefully, we can choose plants that tick many of those boxes. So something like an alpine strawberry, so we get food from that, and we also get pollinating insects, love the strawberry flowers, and also alpine strawberries are a great ground cover, so they fulfill that function. So they actually tick 3 boxes. Also things like a sea buckthorn, so we can eat the berries off a sea buckthorn. It's also nitrogen fixing, and it's also good to have the structure of shrubs within a garden for things like birds to perch on in the winter when they're trying to hunt safely for their food. So as I say, if we can try and pick plants that tick multiple boxes, that serve multiple functions, then we can fit more into a small space. And if you're ready to design your own food forest, no matter how small or large, then check out my food forest design workbook, which is available as a printable PDF. And the idea of this workbook is it breaks the whole process down into tiny, really easy to manage steps. So even if you've never done any designing before and you don't have in-depth knowledge of food forests, then you will be able to follow this guide. Is that by the time you get to the last page, there's 22 pages altogether, that you will have followed all the processes and you will have designed your food forest. So I hope I've managed to convince you that food forests don't have to be huge, that you can put them in even the smallest of gardens, and why wait until you have a big space to start experimenting and trying things out. If you want some more ideas of plants to grow in a small, low maintenance food forest, then check out this video. And please share this video with anyone else who you know who would love to grow their own food, but they think that they don't have the time and the space.